I am not known as a gangster or a bad guy in my community. Only a very small 4% says that, yes, indeed, I am very well known in my community for being a bad guy. The police walk rings around me when I am on the street. Okay, very interesting, right? But so in other words, the overall exposure, 82% is medium exposure, right? Only 13% is high exposure to this whole cycle of violence, the violentization process, right? Which is confounding. Now, of course, the people in the room are going to say, but Leon, the reason that is so is because it's perceptions, right? And have we normalized violence so much that people, where we would expect high exposure, these young guys will just say it's medium exposure. It's not high exposure. Fantastic. Because look, ta-da. Because my surname is Holtzhausen, right? So I have to be, okay. So our preliminary reading, colleagues, and we haven't done enough of this work. We're actually continuing with this research now in Kailicha and Gugeleta, is that it's medium, 87% is indicated medium exposure to the violentization process. The only one that was significant was personal horrification, which was 41%. And the argument then is that this is a central socialization component, where the child sees somebody else, where the child hears about a loved one being violated. Now, here's my question. Is this the missing component that will differentiate life course persistent offenders from adolescence limited offenders? Is this the missing component? Because we know this. We know that if we read the research that's been done in South Africa by some of our colleagues, that your life course persistent offenders is only a small percentage, meaning the guys that start young and continue into the adult life of being violent versus the guys that start young and at some stage kick out of adolescence. They kick out of this choice of violence. Is this maybe the missing link? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leon, and for keeping to your time. Our next speaker is Karen Milford. And we're going to drill right down to the detail of what does it look like? What does the impact of violence look like in one of our level 1 trauma units, which is Rescue Hospital. So Karen's a medical doctor, which means she won't need 20 minutes. She's just going to give us the raw data.
Hi, thanks. My name is Karen. I'm a surgical registrar at Rescue Hospital, which means I'm specializing in surgery. I'm just going to present some preliminary results of an audit we did at the trauma center there. I think I gather most of the people in this room are not medical doctors, so I'll just give you a bit of background regarding what a trauma unit is, or a trauma center. At Rescue, we're very lucky in that we have a dedicated casualties just for sufferers of trauma. We have our medical patients go to a separate place. And so this trauma center is sort of where ultimately many victims of violence and other trauma will end up. I should also just add that what we see at our trauma center is just a snapshot of what's happening in Cape Town. Because it's a tertiary trauma center, it deals with most complicated problems. And many victims are being seen at much lower level facilities, so at secondary and at district level hospitals. And so even though we drain a very large area, we see patients all the way from George, we're only seeing the most complicated things. So staff in trauma units, we all have certain beliefs. When we come on shift, some of these beliefs are outright superstitious, like the belief that if you comment on how quiet the unit is, it will shortly become much busier. Or if you congratulate yourself on managing a patient very well, he's destined to get a terrible complication. But some of the beliefs are sort of rooted in what we believe might be fact. So we believe, for example, that the last weekend of the month is going to be very busy. And we also think sometimes that if it's cold and rainy, maybe people will stay at home, be quiet, look after themselves. And this audit really just looks at these beliefs and tries to tell us whether or not they are actually based in truth. I'm just going to give you a little bit of background from the literature. And this is international literature done in countries like Canada, Iran, in other African countries as well. So many studies show that in good weather, and by this we think of weather that is sort of warm and dry and sunny, many units see an increase in the total amount of trauma. They see fewer accidents. So these are things that happen to people that are not a result of interpersonal violence or of motor vehicle accidents. And then many studies see an increased amount of interpersonal violence in good weather, and this includes sexual assault, deadly assault, and violent crimes. And in bad weather, so this would be your typical Cape Town winter, in wet conditions, some units do see an increase in total admissions there, an increased number of accidents. These are falls and slips resulting in broken bones and other orthopedic trauma, and then increased motor vehicle accidents, which is not unexpected. Looking at the weekday versus weekend, most studies worldwide show an increase in all types of trauma on the weekend, particularly in interpersonal violence. And then when we searched, we couldn't really find any studies comparing the volume of trauma admissions in the middle of the month to the end of the month. So the aim of our study, like I said, is to determine how the patient volume at our trauma centre at Curtis Gate is affected by these external factors, so time of the week, the month, and the season. We wanted to know if different types of trauma were affected differently. And the reason we were doing the study was to look at, firstly, what this meant for staffing for our unit. Was there a more intelligent way to staff our unit if we could anticipate when the busy times would be? And then also to see if there was specific issues we could target, as a group, to look at prevention. So our study site was the trauma centre, and we did a retrospective audit. What we did was go through our trauma logs. So when patients come into the unit, they're entered by a clerk into a large logbook. The clerk will document their name and their particulars, where they come from, and then also their presenting complaint. And this might be a motor vehicle accident, hit over the head, slipped and fell, that kind of thing. We went through about 18 months of trauma logs, and then we divided the patients into 4 categories. So those who had suffered from in motor vehicle accidents. This includes everything, so any kind of car-related accident, any kind of pedestrian versus car, train accidents, bicycle versus car, all of those. And then any interpersonal violence, and these were patients who had either reported themselves as being injured in an argument or an altercation, or who were reported as by the person bringing them in. Accidents were sort of everything that didn't fit into the other 2 categories: people who injured themselves while at work, slipped and fell, injured themselves while playing sport. And then we see a small group of patients who fall into a miscellaneous category, patients who've got things like rings stuck on their fingers that they need us to cut off. It happens quite often. Just a few more definitions, weekday versus weekend. So I defined the week as the time between 8 a.m. on a Monday to 8 p.m. on a Friday. The weekend was defined as from Friday 8 p.m. to Monday 8 a.m. For mid-month, I looked at the weekend closest to the 15th day of the month, and month end was the weekend closest to the last day of the month. And then summer, we all know, is the 1st of December to the 28th of February, which is supposed to be warm and dry, and winter is the 1st of June to the 31st of August, which is cold and miserable. I just used Microsoft Excel for my stats and did a t-test, and for this study, statistical significance is defined as a p-value of less than 0.05. So ultimately, we assessed about 534 days, so that's 24-hour periods from 8 a.m. on the one day to 8 a.m. on the following day, and this totals up to just over 1,000 shifts. In this time, we saw just under 17,000 patients. So this is our first slide. How do I get the little...
No, don't ask me.
Do you know? Okay, I'm not gonna, you guys can see. So what you're looking at, the very top graph, that one over there, shows the total number of patients seen in our unit, and these are averages per shift. So these are numbers of patients seen in a 12-hour shift. So the top graph is patients, top graph is patients, total numbers of patients seen. The yellow graph, this yellow graph points to accidents. So like I said, those are work injuries or sport injuries. This reddish line here is the interpersonal violence, and the final line is the motor vehicle accidents. And I think what's blatantly obvious from the graph is that our numbers peak on a Saturday and on a weekend, tapering off slightly towards the Sunday. and that there's a definite peak in interpersonal violence on the weekend. Just to look at the actual numbers, so our motor vehicle accidents are slightly increased on the weekend. It's a small increase, but it's statistically significant. And then in the interpersonal violence group, we see about double the number of patients on a weekend shift than what we do on a weekday shift. That is not to say that we don't see many people on a weekday. We see almost 5 people per shift. That will be almost 10 people a day suffering from interpersonal violence. And then our total numbers are very much increased on the weekend as well. People tend to have other accidents less on the weekend, which probably speaks to the fact that most of them are injuring themselves at work. But I think this large increase, this large spike in the interpersonal violence group on the weekend speaks to what Leon was saying, which is that, you know, victims and perpetrators of interpersonal violence are normal people. And there are people, you know, the study isn't designed to look at why we have a big spike on the weekend, it's just to show us that we do. But it probably speaks to the fact that these are people who during the week do the things normal non-criminals do, which is work, go to school, that kind of thing, and on the weekend are more likely to assault each other. Looking at the mid-month versus the month end, we do have a small increase in the numbers. Once again, the orange at the back is our total numbers. The red is the interpersonal violence category. And there is also, once again, a statistically significant increase in interpersonal violence at the month end, as well as in the total numbers of patients seen. We specifically asked this question because our question is, are people more likely to become victims of interpersonal violence or to assault each other around payday? And then looking at summer versus winter, once again, the orange is our total number of patients. So we see slightly more patients during the summer and also slightly more interpersonal violence during the summer. It's a small difference, but it is statistically significant. So in conclusion, at our trauma center, our weekends are significantly busier than our weekdays. And this is particularly in the interpersonal violence category. And then there is, in addition, another slight increase, which is significant, on summer and month-end weekends. Like I said, in particular, victims of interpersonal violence will present in greater numbers. What we also plan to look at further with our data and with the study is whether or not there's a relationship between trauma and soccer. There aren't many studies done on this, but one study, for example, was done in Virginia in the United States, which showed that men were more likely to assault their wives if their home football team won. So we'll be taking... it's that violentization idea. They believe from that study that men who see other men being applauded for behaving violently, American football is quite a violent game, feel justified in behaving violently back. That was the conclusion that study drew. So we'll be looking at our volumes comparing home versus away games and wins versus losses and draws. For this talk, we just sort of look crudely at summer and winter, but we'd like to take a more detailed look at the volumes of trauma, comparing it to specific temperatures and precipitation. Yeah, so discussion points from this talk are why we have such big spikes in interpersonal violence on the weekends. Could we put interventions in place to curb the spike, and what it means for our unit staffing? Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yep. Okay, but thank you to all three of the speakers for providing us with some really interesting thinking, data, to continue the discussion. We've got, it's 10:20, so we've got 30, 35 minutes, possibly even 40 if we push to about 10 to. I'll see how the discussion goes. What I'll do is maybe take a round of 3 or 4 hands. You can make a comment, direct your comment to any of the speakers. There might be linkages between what the various speakers have said. Get them to respond, and then we'll take another round and just see how it goes. And if you speak, please identify yourself. Just say who you are and where you're from. So I've got 1, 2, okay, 3. Yeah. Okay, why don't you?
Hello, my name's Jonathan Hoffenberg. I'm a social worker and I work for Shawco. Two questions, one for everybody. The first two use the term normalization, and my understanding of normalization is the taking of something that is not normal and the normalizing of it. Do you possibly think that maybe it's not that we keep on looking at violence as if it's apparent, as if it's not normal, but maybe actually it is normal and that we're naturally an extremely violent species? And this speaks right down to our first hunter-gatherer roots where, you know, it was either we got eaten or we had to eat. But what I'm more interested in is the narrative process, the stories we tell, which were first those stories of hunting, of I was really hungry, I saw the mammoth, I kind of nailed it, he almost got me, I managed to get him, woo! And that then through stories, this normalization of the narrative of violence. And specifically, Leon, I was interested in the personal horrification. What do you think this then says about media? Because, you know, as a parent, the thing that has really struck me is how much, and I'm raising two boys, how much their discourse, their narrative in almost all of the media is all about tales of violence.
Thanks, John. Natalie.
Hi, I'm Natalie James from the Small Arms Survey. I have, Adele, can I ask 3 questions?
Sure.
One for each of the panelists. So firstly for Anthony, brilliant presentation. I wish you'd had a little bit more time. Very controversial. My question is, I mean, I'm coming from a decidedly non-psychodynamic perspective, so I might be completely ignorant here, but the way that you describe South Africans' love of violence and our response, how does that compare to other post-conflict, post-war societies? And is there any literature, or what are your thoughts rather, in terms of if mechanisms like truth commissions, those kinds of interventions, national, symbolic, official interventions like that can actually make a difference in terms of that kind of response? Because you didn't mention the legacy of apartheid, and colonialism, of course. Then to Leon, fascinating, really, really fascinating. You didn't mention the role of bystanders. So you spoke about victims, about perpetrators. Is there anything in bystanders, some interesting stuff on bystander intervention and how this might feed into the personal horrification and the extent to which that can possibly be disrupted? And then to Karen, thanks very much for your presentation. My question is, as your last little point, what does this mean for trauma unit staffing? Again, I mean, I'm quite clueless on this score. Are there existing policies in place whereby there are more staff, you know, in the trauma unit over weekends and month end? And what, if not, what would it take for a policy change to actually be enacted? It seems like it's needed. Thanks.
Right. Thanks, Natalie.
I'm Karen Grace from the Faculty of Education. I'm a lecturer there. I also have 2 questions, one for Anthony and one for Leon. First question is, what is the main objective of your paper? I didn't quite get that. And then Leon, do you physically go into the township to collect your data? And how do you select your sample?
The panel.
It's a very short one. Grania Perkins, Detective Surgeon with Interpol, currently with UCT. Very interested in the last discussion, particularly from the statistical point of view, and how that feeds into the SaVI. Foucault would have used weather as one of the first indicators when we look at how to control violence. Has your studies, have they been used at all by the police here in terms of the staffing of the violence in the hospital, or indeed the areas that it's coming from?
Okay. Anthony, why do we?
Okay, so there's 3 different questions. The first one, your question around normalization, and what the problem is that there are two different meanings of the word normalization. The one is statistical, that something becomes a statistical norm. Most people are doing that. And then there's a kind of a moral/ideological meaning of normalization. Oh no, that's normal. Meaning it's right and proper and done that way. And we confound those two meanings. It's really important to separate them. And so most of us are talking about a kind of statistical normalization of violence, that violence is very common in society, but wanting to kind of sort of morally and conceptually denormalize it and say, but that's bad. The statistical normalization is not normal in an ethical sense, so that it's bad for societies to be like that. We'd rather be this different kind of society. And the problem is these kind of normalizing narratives which say, oh, people are they're just bad, they're just violent, we hunter-gatherers, men were trained to hunt animals, therefore they rape people now, and that's normal. And there's a particular kind of ideological work that is done by those narratives in terms of doing the moral normalization of violence. And I think we need to be very skeptical of that for one simple reason. The problem with those kind of normalizing narratives is they don't account for the fact that different societies have widely differing levels of violence, and that different individuals through their lifetimes have widely different levels of violence. And I think that really problematizes those. Okay, the next question is comparing South Africa to other post-conflict societies. And I have little to say about that because I'm not a kind of sort of global politics kind of person. I mean, this is a standing problem, the way violence perpetuates itself in post-conflict societies, and societies particularly go through a kind of a moment of independence. And South Africa is a kind of classic example. Go from a kind of very sort of violent, totalitarian, military-controlled state to a democratic, human rights-based state. A lot of countries have tried to do that, and then somehow they fail, and you get this gap between the intention of the new utopian state and the kind of everyday practices of violence underneath that. And I think we see that in places like Russia today as well. But I can't give you detailed analyses. One of the things that interests me is where that didn't happen. And one of the big cases is Second World War. Like Second